Hi and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be having a look at some key tips to help you become a better Age of Empires 4 player. Lots of these tips are also going to be applicable to Age of Empires 2 if that's more your thing. So with that said, let's get straight into it. So tip 1 is to make use of your scout. You'll start with a scout at the start of the game and you should send them off around the map to look for key points of interest. Identifying where your enemy is early on, as well as any resources around you or key landmarks, will certainly help to give you a head start in the match. You should also continue to scout throughout the whole game to keep an eye on what your enemy is doing. I'll touch on that more in tip 4. Tip 2 is to make sure that you never let your town centre sit idle. At your town centre, you'll be able to produce villagers, and villagers are the unit that are going to be gathering the key resources that you need to finance your economy. You should ideally be making sure that you always have some villagers queued for production at your town centre. Typically, you can have no more than 200 units in a match at any given time. A useful tip is to aim to have up to 50% of your population count as villagers. So tip 3 is all about the military. We've talked about villagers and how important they are to funding our economy, but we're going to need some military to win the match. So there are 4 ages in Age of Empires, and typically you will start in the first of these. So once you reach the second age, also known as the feudal age, this is where you should really start to be focusing on producing some military units. And as you go on to reach ages 3 and 4, this is where you should be really ramping up production of your military. So the majority of your military, certainly initially, will likely come from the barracks, the stables and the archery range. It's useful to know that within the game there's essentially a triad of power that exists, whereby spearmen from the barracks will counter horses from the stables, who will counter archers from the archery range, who will in turn counter spearmen from the barracks. It's therefore really important to make sure that your military has a variety of different unit types within it, otherwise you're going to be vulnerable from counter-attacks from the enemy. Of course, this military triangle explanation doesn't cover all unit types within the game and their possible counters, but it does give you a really useful starting point. So tip 4 is about being strategic about the military units that we're producing and making counter units to the ones that we know the enemy has available to them. So we talked about continually scouting the map in tip 2, and about the triad of power that exists with military units in tip 3. We can combine those 2 tips here. So for example, if we've identified from our scout that the enemy is producing a large number of cavalry, then that can be a prompt to us to start producing more spearmen, for example. We can continue to be flexible and continue to adjust our military production based on which units we see the enemy producing. So the next tip is around producing multiple military buildings. As a match goes on, you should have enough resources to produce multiple barracks, archery ranges and stables. Having multiple buildings is going to be really important to allow you to quickly produce units if needed. It's much quicker to be producing a small number of units at multiple buildings versus having a large queue at one building. The next tip is simply to make use of the upgrades that are available for purchase at the Blacksmith. This building is often overlooked, especially by new players, but the upgrades that you can purchase there will really help your military in battle. As an example, you can purchase upgrades which will strengthen the armour that your troops have. The next tip, which may appear obvious, is to make sure that you purchase upgrades for your different troops at their respective military buildings when you age up. There will typically be an upgrade available after each age up, and purchasing that upgrade for a small fee will upgrade any of that selected unit type into the new kind, and any purchases of that unit type going forwards will be the updated version. So the next tip is about siege units, which can be purchased in a siege workshop. Bear in mind that siege workshops can't be built until the 3rd age, which is also known as the castle age, so you won't be able to build these units straight away. Typically, siege units are going to be expensive and fairly slow moving. There are different types of siege units available, with each having their own strengths and weaknesses. If you're planning on storming an attack on the enemy, then battering rams are going to be a really effective unit to help you bring down their buildings. They're going to be super effective against walls or bringing down defensive buildings such as keeps or outposts. Bear in mind that without protection from other units, siege units are going to be very vulnerable to attack from the enemy. You'll want to protect them the best you can due to their significant cost of purchase. Okay, so the next tip is looking at the monastery and using monks to your advantage. Monks can be used to convert enemy units into your own units. They can also be used to capture sacred sites, which is going to be useful depending on which game type you're playing. However, one of the most important things that the monks can do is to heal your troops that have been injured in battle. This is really important, as obviously healing the units that you've got rather than making new ones is going to save you on resources. Just note that monks are actually a fairly weak unit, so it's best to keep them back from the immediate front line of action. You can always call your troops back slightly to a relative place of safety where the monks can heal the troops. The other really useful thing that monks can do is to capture relics that are dotted around the map. Once a monk brings a relic back to a monastery, it can be stored in there and it will continue to give the player a steady stream of gold as long as it stays in the monastery. You can find where relics are by scouting the map. So the next tip is focusing on repairing any damaged ships or siege units that we might have. One way that you can repair ships is to send a fishing ship to that boat, and the fishing ship will actually repair the boat itself. Alternatively, you can bring the boat into the shoreline and villagers can then be directed to repair the boat. Villagers can also be sent to repair damaged siege units. It's really good to repair your units because, as we talked about with the monks and healing troops, it's easier to repair the ones we've got rather than making new versions, which is going to cost resources. So this next tip is to make sure that you build a market and make sure to use this throughout the game. At the market, you'll be able to buy and sell the various different resources that you might need. So as an example, you might have lots of wood or food in a match, but you might be running very low on gold or stone. As mentioned, at the market, you have the option to exchange your different resources so that you can get hold of the ones that you may need. The next tip is also resource related. It's sometimes overlooked, especially by new players, that you can purchase upgrades at the various different resource gathering buildings. On aging up, at the lumber camps, mining camps and mills, you can purchase upgrades which will confer advantages for your resource gathering. As an example, a lumber camp upgrade may mean that your villagers can gather wood more quickly. Especially when you have lots of villagers, these upgrades are really helpful to make sure that your economy is booming. So the next tip is about taking the fight to the enemy. Shown here is my original base that I've started with in the match, but you can see that I've developed a further base which is closer to the enemy. To win the match, you need to control the map, and there's the danger that if you just sit back in your original base, then the enemy may come and overpower you. If we can make lots of military buildings, as we talked about in a previous tip, close to the enemy base, then we have a platform to be able to quickly produce troops to send in to attack the enemy. Okay, so the next tip is to make use of keeps and outposts, which are defensive buildings. Outposts, once constructed, will give you a significant line of sight increase. This line of sight can be really useful to identify if the enemy is coming towards you. They're also a very good place of safety. You can garrison units in here if they're under attack, and the outpost will then actually have the ability to fire arrows at the enemy. Keeps are heavily fortified structures which serve as a similar purpose to castles in Age of Empires 2. They can fire at the enemy, and their defensive capabilities can also be upgraded significantly to give them more attacking power. The final tip is to look around the map and make use of any geographical features. This hill is conveniently located next to a key landmark as well as some resources, and it's going to be a really good place to occupy and defend. Another geographical tip is to make sure that you don't build too many of your buildings right on the shoreline. There is a possibility that if they're too close, enemy ships will be able to get up to the shore and destroy your buildings, so be mindful of this when you're designing your town. And so that brings us to the end of the video, and I really hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. I'd really appreciate your support with subscribing and liking the video. I also have some other Age of Empires 4 videos that I'd be really grateful if you could check out. Thanks again.